Hello and welcome to News Center. I'm Parikshit Luthra. A case for military modernization and expansion are doubling down on the stringent zero-COVID policy and calls for the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. President Xi Jinping's two-hour speech on the opening day of the China Communist Party Congress cast himself as the unilateral power center ahead of an unprecedented third term and cemented his position as the nation's most powerful leader since Mao Zedong. Apart from taking a dig at the US, citing foreign interference in Taiwan and justifying the security law that effectively criminalized dissent in Hong Kong, Jinping also laid out the key growth drivers for the world's second largest economy: innovation, high-quality education, self-reliance in science and technology. President Xi also vowed to speed up efforts to build the People's Liberation Army, or the PLA, into a world-class military. Let's listen in to what Xi Jinping had to say.
Resolving the Taiwan question is the matter for the Chinese, a matter that must be resolved by us. We will continue to strive for a peaceful reunification with the greatest sincerity and the utmost effort. But we will never promise to renounce the use of force, and we reserve the option of taking all necessary measures. We insisted on putting the people and their lives above all else and tenaciously pursued a dynamic zero-COVID policy. We launched an all-out people's war to fight against the pandemic and protected the people's health and safety to the greatest extent possible. We made tremendous achievements in striking a balance between epidemic response and economic and social development.
Joining me now to take this discussion forward is a very special guest, Vijay Gokhale, former Foreign Secretary. He has also served as India's ambassador to Germany and China as High Commissioner to Malaysia. Mr. Gokhale has recently authored a book, After Tiananmen, The Rise of China. The book talks about contemporary China, how it handled its domestic and external environment post the 1989 Tiananmen massacre. Mr. Gokhale, thank you very much for joining us here on CNBC TV18. Let me begin by quoting an excerpt from your book. You have written that the Chinese strategy for 20 years, since 1993 to about 2012, was play the West, woo the rest, hide your capacities and bide your time. President Xi took over in 2012. 10 years on, as he's set to get a third term at the 20th Party Congress, what is Xi Jinping's strategy going to be?
Parikshit, thank you for having me on your program. We must realize that by 2010, China had undergone fundamental changes. Its economy was now a $10 trillion economy, and it had much more global influence. And therefore, President Xi Jinping has clearly outlined two important goals. What is important at this party congress is that Xi Jinping has declared that poverty has been eradicated in China. The two goals now are, by 2035, to make China a moderately prosperous society which is on par with the Western developed nations. And by 2049, in Xi Jinping's own words, is to build China into a country that leads the world in terms of composite national power and international influence. In short, Parikshit, the message is that by the middle of this century, China, at least in the view of the Chinese Communist Party, intends to topple the United States from the perch of the #1 power in the world.
Right. That is a clear intention coming from President Xi Jinping. Let me also ask you about another excerpt from your book, and this is again regarding the United States. You said that in January 1959, Mao Zedong prophesied that the United States is attempting to carry out its aggression and expansion with a much more deceptive tactic. In other words, it wants to keep its order and change our system. Do you think this is something which is still a priority, a worry for President Xi Jinping, and this is exactly what they will try and counter? The United States will be China's enemy #1. They may never say so, but will always treat US that way?
One of the underlying threads of the Chinese Communist Party's approach has been the firm belief that the United States represents an existential threat to it. This is a thread that runs from Mao Zedong to Xi Jinping. Sometimes this goes subterranean, as it did during Deng Xiaoping's time, because they required American technology and money. But it has now resurfaced under President Xi Jinping. And according to them, they see a systemic challenge coming from the United States, particularly since President Trump took office. That challenge is economic, it is technological, and it is geopolitical. And recent United States actions, including the export control policy on semiconductors, for instance, or the CHIPS Act, will only strengthen the belief in the Chinese leadership about the determination of the United States to keep China subordinate. So what we can expect to see is a significant amount of tension and rivalry between them. But we should also not forget that these are the world's two largest economies. They are interlinked quite closely, and therefore this will be a fundamentally different competition to the one between the United States and the Soviet Union in the Cold War.
Right. I'd like to pursue that a little more. When it comes to semiconductors, now these recent export controls by the US Department of Commerce, Mr. Gokhale, they are far-reaching and quite sweeping in nature. They are literally putting a ban on every country, every company from exporting any product which has been made either by a US citizen or using US technology to China. How is this likely to impact China? We've seen a sharp reaction from the Chinese semiconductor industry.
We saw an initial impact when there was a limited decision to ban export of sophisticated chips to Huawei in 2018 and 19. It, in one sense, paralyzed Huawei and ZTE, the two Chinese companies who are in the 5G space. Now what the United States has done is not only to limit the export of semiconductors themselves, but also to prevent them from getting the software and the tools to develop and design semiconductors, as well as the machinery to manufacture them. In a sense, this is like strangling or choking the entire semiconductor chain. Now, of course, in the short term, this will cause a considerable amount of difficulty to Chinese. But the Chinese have, over the past few years, through government funds, invested in the semiconductor business, both in design and in manufacturing. It has not been entirely successful. On the other hand, they have been able to make some progress, and we can expect that they will try to rise to the challenge that the United States has thrown them. We have to see, however, what the practical impact in the short term is of the CHIPS Act and of the recent export control policy announced by the United States.
Right. Mr. Gokhale, now coming back to the party Congress, what does this Congress, the tone of his speech, the 2-hour-long speech, really mean for his next 5 years about his intentions to continue ruling over China?
We must remember, Parikshit, that this is a speech that is addressed to the domestic audience. It is not addressed to you and me or to a foreign audience. And essentially, therefore, the tone of the speech was to set out the achievements of the president and the party in the past 10 years since he has been in power. Secondly, to highlight the challenges of the past 5 years, both in terms of the pandemic and in terms of a worsening economic climate due to protectionism and unilateralism. And lastly, to set out the goals for the coming 5 years. Therefore, we should not look at the speech for any clues as to specifically what the president might do in terms of certain difficult problems that might arise. It is, in a sense, a reassurance to the people of China that the Communist Party is strong, that it is aware of the problems, and that it is prepared to meet the expectations of the Chinese people, both on national security and on economic policy. And he has broadly outlined the reasons for this, citing the risks and challenges in the international geopolitical and geoeconomic situation. And he has also highlighted some of the new areas of concern, issues like the environment, digitization, the social welfare and security net. These are all things that concern the people, and I think he has touched upon them. But essentially, this is a speech of broad policy. It is not a specific policy speech, and therefore we must not approach it from that perspective, but look at it as a kind of broad overview of where he intends to lead China in the next few years.
Right. Just to speak about Hong Kong, Taiwan, about their strategic intentions, we have seen China getting very aggressive about their territorial ambitions and expansionist tendencies as well. One of his messages was full control over Hong Kong has been achieved. China will never commit to abandoning the use of force when it comes to Taiwan. This was one of the statements made by President Xi at the opening of the party Congress. Who is this message for, and what does it say about President Xi's intentions?
Again, Parikshit, the message is primarily domestic. I think that he is reassuring his own people that the recent developments in Hong Kong, which of course the West has portrayed as a crackdown, was required because there were subversive elements that were intent on separating Hong Kong from the mainland. On Taiwan, I would once again say that he is essentially reiterating a line that was first pronounced by Deng Xiaoping, which is that they will strive for peaceful reunification of Taiwan with China. But what he has also done in the speech is sent a message to his own people and to the rest of the world that there will no longer be strategic ambiguity about the Chinese position, that they are prepared to go to any length and use any means to achieve unification if it cannot be done peacefully and if there is interference from abroad. To that extent, I think it clarifies what was already perhaps known to much of the world. But as I said, now that strategic ambiguity in their position has been removed, and he has left the world in no doubt that while he wishes to have peaceful reunification, he will not hesitate to use force if he feels that that goal is being thwarted by somebody else.
Right. Mr. Gokhale, just to speak about his term and how Xi Jinping is different from some of his predecessors. You've written in your book, by the end of Xi Jinping's first term in office as General Secretary of the party in 2017, it seemed as if the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation was entirely Xi's achievement and owed little to his predecessors. Even as you say, the speech at the party Congress was meant for a domestic audience. How will Xi Jinping be different from some of the historic figures in Chinese politics?
Well, there's no gainsaying that this is a personalistic style of leadership. But my own sense is that comparisons with previous leaders is not really a sensible way to go about it, because circumstances change and different leaders act differently in circumstances. What we can say is that he is not Mao Zedong, because Mao enjoyed working and living in a chaotic situation, whereas Xi Jinping stands for order. Nor is he Deng Xiaoping, because Deng believed in the core power of the Communist Party, but he also agreed that we need a system of governance which is not personal in nature, but where power is spread across the Politburo Standing Committee. Whereas Xi Jinping, as we know, has a personalistic style of relationship. And he gave a clue about his two immediate predecessors, Presidents Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin's rule, when he said that he was confronted when he assumed power with weak, hollowed out, and watered down political leadership. In other words, he was suggesting that his immediate predecessor had allowed the party's influence and power over the economy, the military, and other aspects of life to slide, and that this was endangering the party. So Xi Jinping's basic message in this party Congress has been that he has regained that control of the party over the instruments of the state, that he has regained control of the party over the economy, and that he intends to continue down the path that he has outlined in the past 10 years. What, of course, his status will be after the 23rd of October is speculation at this point of time. Some people have suggested that they may revive the post of chairman of the party, a position that was held by Mao Zedong, but since abolished. We will have to wait until the 23rd of October to discover what these constitutional amendments are and how they affect his personal position.
All right. Very importantly, Mr. Gokhale, you spoke about continuity. There was a focus on continuity in his speech when it came to economic policies. We've seen a major crackdown on the Chinese tech sector, the property sector, entertainment, online gaming. We'll come to all of that in just a bit. We're going to take a short break here on News Center, but don't go anywhere. This conversation with Mr. Vijay Gokhale continues on the other side. Welcome back. China's President Xi Jinping looks set for an unprecedented third term and is expected to reshuffle the Communist Party's top deck, defends a zero-COVID policy and calls for military modernization along with a warning to the world on Taiwan. We're in conversation with former Foreign Secretary Vijay Gokhale. Mr. Gokhale, when it comes to economic policies, we are looking at an unprecedented slowdown in China. 3.3% growth rate is what is being predicted for this year. This is the slowest pace for China in 4 decades. A lot of this is being attributed to the crackdown of the tech sector, the property sector, the zero-COVID strategy, the housing market policies. How do you think President Xi is going to approach the economic crisis that China is facing right now? Will there be a continuity of policies? Will there be interventions?
Well, there's no doubt that there is an economic slowdown, Parikshit. But this is something that the leadership has expected for some time. And as far back as 5 years ago, President Xi Jinping has already said that what matters is not the GDP numbers, but the ability for all Chinese to prosper. And therefore, the new development concept that he has introduced is what is called common prosperity. In other words, that there must be no regional inequities and no inequities in income between the highest and the lowest income brackets. Now, there are 3 important strategies that he has outlined in this report, at least to my understanding. First, he has very clearly said that the industry will continue to be dominated by the public sector or the state-owned sector. And he has said that it is important that they become bigger and they get stronger and they do better. Secondly, he has clearly said he intends to make it easier for the private sector to do business. But he has also said that there is corruption in certain sectors where there is a high concentration of power, funds, and resources. And these are sectors like online gaming, higher education online, and the tech sector. And I think the message is we will not allow the private sector to corrupt the power of the Communist Party or to destabilize it. The third message is both to its own people and to the outside world, which is that in facing a challenge from the West, China must harden its domestic supply chains, it must internationalize its currency, it must concentrate its resources on high-end original research and development, and it must ensure that there are no measures taken in terms of sanctions or protectionism that will cripple the Chinese economy. Now, of course, he has not gone into any details in this report on how he intends to do so, nor has he elaborated how he intends to tackle the property bubble or the excess investment in the infrastructure sector. But one point I do want to mention is that for the past 30 or 35 years, whenever a crisis has occurred, the tendency of the rest of the world has been to say that there will be a coming collapse of China. That hasn't happened, partly because of China's own economic strengths, partly because the leadership has reformed whenever it needs to do so. And therefore, we must not automatically presume that the current difficulties, however great they are, will lead to an economic collapse. It will certainly lead to an economic slowdown, and we have to see how that impacts us in India as well as the rest of the world. But it is still an $18 trillion economy, and it is still a major global engine of growth.
Right. Mr. Gokhale, coming to the question of India, we've had a difficult relationship with China. How do you see the India-China relationship progressing, moving ahead in the next 5 years of President Xi Jinping's term? What are the areas, what are the issues, the challenges that one needs to watch out for?
Well, I think we all know that the relationship is undergoing stress and tension because of the developments along the line of actual control since 2020. Essentially, the action that the Chinese side took has resulted in this state of peaceful coexistence being transformed into what I call a state of armed coexistence. Of course, the two sides have talked since then. My understanding of the talks from what I read in the media is that there has been a partial de-escalation and that talks are continuing on de-escalating and eventually disengaging in other parts of along the India-China LAC as well. In his own speech yesterday, Xi Jinping did not really go into foreign policy in any detail. But what he did say was that he wants to enhance partnerships and relationships with neighboring countries, without naming any of them, of course. And he also said he wants to converge interests of China with the neighboring countries. Now, we have to see what practical shape he gives to these words in terms of China's foreign policy towards India. So far as India is concerned, my understanding is that unless the Chinese return the relationship back to what it was in 2019, it is not likely that full normalcy or complete normalcy will be restored. One final point, Parikshit. We have to take note of what President Xi Jinping also said with relation to building up the modernization of the Chinese forces, because this has implications for us as well. Again, he didn't go into any detail, but what he said was that China will strengthen its strategic deterrence, which means its nuclear weapons capability, and we already know that they are increasing this both qualitatively and quantitatively. He also said that they will focus on new domain forces and on unmanned intelligent combat forces to win local wars. And local war is a typical word they use for things like conflicts in the periphery. And finally, he has said that the push on maritime security will continue, which means that we should fully expect to see a near permanent presence of the Chinese Navy in the Indian Ocean by the end of this decade. Obviously, all this will pose challenges to us, but I have no doubt that the relevant people in our government, in our military, in our foreign ministry are already aware of this and are focused on handling the matter.
All right, we've run out of time, but thank you very much for helping us understand and decode President Xi's speech at the 20th Party Congress, what it means for the Chinese economy, and what are some of the cues that India and the world can also pick up. Thank you very much, Mr. Gokhale, for joining us here on News Center. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of News Center. News and updates continue on CNBC-TV18. Stay tuned.